Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, In-Country Translation Reviews, Added Value or Added Stress. My name's Barb Sitchell. I'm the Director of Business Development here at International Language Services, and I'm joined by Jules Taggart of Taggart Marketing Strategy, who's assisted me in putting together this presentation today. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. We value education for our clients extremely highly. We feel that the more educated our clients are, the more they understand the translation process, the happier and more satisfied they are with our services. The reason we've opted to speak about translation reviews today is because I find in my interaction with clients that this is something that usually doesn't get talked about at the front end of a project. It's something that usually will come into play often unexpectedly on the back end of a project, and it tends to cause a lot more trouble, a lot more activity, requires a lot more response than it's often worth. So this is something that our clients get into without fully understanding how to best approach it, or even without necessarily having a clear reason of why they're doing it. Basically, they don't give any thought as to the can of worms that they might be opening. So we're going to take about 45 minutes today to address this topic and hopefully provide you with some best practices as far as how you can leverage your native speaking associates when you're doing translations. Just by way of housekeeping, we do have your phones muted. There is a chat pane, question and answer pane at the bottom of your screen. If you scroll down, you should be able to access that. We'll address as many questions as we have time for during the webinar. Here's just a high-level overview of who International Language Services is. We've been providing business translation services for 35 years. We specialize primarily in the manufacturing industry, specifically medical device manufacturing and industrial manufacturing, although we do work with a host of other industries. We'll translate anything from basic business communications, your internal documentation, your marketing materials, websites, on up through your highly technical operators manuals for industrial equipment. Our translators are subject matter experts assigned to projects based on their ability to readily comprehend the subject matter being addressed, to fully understand the source documentation, and of course they're all native speakers in the target languages. In-country review is largely a client-controlled process, so the exact definition varies, but just so that we're on the same page for the purpose of this presentation, we've defined it as our clients involving someone outside of our organization. Usually it's a local office, a field rep, a distributor, some sort of a colleague or a partner that they work with regularly, someone that they trust, and usually someone who has a stake in using the translated materials. I do want to stress that an in-country translation review is generally not a part of the translation process when you hire an outside firm. So it's something that clients will do on their own. And the reason it causes so many issues is because you're essentially inserting a non-professional into an already established quality control process. And very often this is done after the fact without first informing your translation services provider, so that there's really no opportunity for them to guide you through the process and help you avoid some of the common pitfalls. And as I stated earlier, a translation in-country review can often create a lot of heartburn without adding a lot of value. And that's the key reason that we want to talk about this today. Before we get into it, let's look at the qualifications and role of a professional translator. And again, this is just a real high-level overview, but generally when we are providing translation services to our clients, we're providing those through the use of translators who have been fully vetted through our ISO quality processes. And very often those translators come to us certified by third-party agencies, meaning that they've been tested in their subject matter expertise and also their ability to translate within a specific language pair. And a language pair would mean the source language and the target language. So basically they've been tested for what they can do, their ability to do it well. Functionally, what we expect from our translators is that they're going to be conveying your original meaning to your target audience exactly as you wrote it. They're going to be tasked with retaining your corporate voice, your tone, and they're going to localize the translated text so that it's readily accepted by your target audience. Translators are essentially craftsmen. You may know people who have the qualifications to be a translator on paper. However, they're still not well suited for translation as their profession. We work with our translators over long periods of time. We've established standards with them for the speed at which they'll work and exactly the level of services that they'll be providing. Companies take it upon themselves to involve their in-country colleagues in the translation process for a variety of reasons. Most often, we find that there's a tendency to want to get a buy-in from the field. And we hear things like, well, if they're going to be the people using the translation, we want to be sure that they're happy with it. More often than not, we find that underlying that is a discomfort with the translation services provider that's been chosen. They're overly afraid of errors. They're not really certain that the translation provider is going to provide correct translations, so they feel that there's this need to have things checked. Occasionally, the whole issue of in-country review comes up after the fact in a very informal way. That is, the translation gets out there, and then later you start to get feedback from folks in the field. It may be part of your company's culture, and it might even be a requirement for you to incorporate feedback that you receive from the field. But just keep in mind that if you've selected the appropriate translation services provider, it's not really necessary to engage these field people. So put it in the perspective of any other process within your firm. If you're doing product development, product design, creating marketing collateral, more than likely you've got a small designated team who owns this process, and then possibly you've got a slightly larger group that you've engaged to provide additional input. If you're going to go down the road of in-country review for your translations, first of all, whether to proceed with this is important, but also how to proceed. You're going to want to have the same level of process control and discipline that you would have if you were engaged in any other process within your company. Again, here's a summary of the reasons why we think that clients will utilize in-country review. Very often it's because they're very fearful of errors. Now, you may have a message that's so precise or a product that's so potentially dangerous that your in-house quality process requires this additional safety check on all of your documentation, including your translated files. In practice, however, we only see a slight correlation between the importance of the document and whether or not an in-house review is done. It tends to have a lot more to do with the personality of the project owner or your corporate culture. So here's the real question, is that effective? When you have a need to have documents translated, usually there's a tight timeline involved. You've got something on the other end, a training, product installation, product launch, policy implementation. Something is happening on the other end that requires that you get these translations done quickly and that you're able to provide translations that are consistent with your original message. If you're going to outsource these translations, we have to assume that you've vetted your translation services provider so that there's a reasonable level of competence that they'll provide suitable translations for you. So again, this notion that you need your own people just to be sure is not necessarily valid. However, if you are going to incorporate your in-country speakers into the translation process, we want to make sure that you do it in the most effective way so that you get the benefit of their knowledge without derailing your entire project. So here's the tips that we're going to be reviewing today. So let's start with the first one, creating a glossary of key terms. This is one of the most effective measures that you can take to either sidestep the need to have your translations reviewed after they're completed, or simply to simplify the entire translation review process. Your native speakers may or may not be translation experts, but they certainly should know your key technical terms and how you speak about your products and services. And what a glossary does is it enables you to essentially capture this information at the front end of a project so that you can then deliver a translation that's going to be well received at the other end of the project. This is usually a much happier situation than having your in-country native speakers correct the finished result that you've delivered without their input. So when I speak about terminology, I'll define that for you, but terminology is usually what triggers the most complaints about translations. When we refer to terminology, we're talking about your key industry terms or your company-specific terms or your keyword usage. For example, when you use the term flexible to describe your product, do you mean that it has many uses or that it bends without breaking? Defining some of these terms up front is going to ease the entire translation process. It'll help your translators get up to speed more quickly, and it'll help them deliver spot-on translations that you're looking for. Now, there's several different ways that you can approach this. You might choose to provide an English-only glossary to your translator. And again, this would include your company-specific terms, your corporate terms that you use to speak about your products. For example, here at ILS, we use ILS a lot to describe our company. It stands for International Language Services. That's not something that we would want to have translated because it's our company name. Wouldn't make sense for us to translate it. But when we use that abbreviation, ILS, if we were having a document translated, we would certainly want the translator to understand what we mean by that acronym. There might be other abbreviations. We use the term TM a lot internally here. It stands for translation memory. That's not something that I would expect somebody outside of our industry or outside of our company to readily know. You can define other terms for your translation services firm. For example, the word switch. If you're using that in your documentation, let them know if that's a noun or a verb. A terminology list does not need to be lengthy. Very often it's only a half dozen terms or maybe a dozen or 24 terms. It's usually quite short. But if you go through some of your files, you'll see that there's wordage that you're using that might not be readily understood by those outside of your company. You might also opt to float this list past your in-country folks, the folks that you would normally use to review a translation, and have them provide their preferred translation for these terms. So if you're translating into 6 languages, put together an Excel spreadsheet that has English in one column and another column for each of the languages, and let your in-country folks provide the translations that they would like to see in the finished documents. This takes a little more time and energy up front, but it involves your in-country folks in the process early on so that they're more likely to be happy with the translations that they receive on the back end. The last way that you might want to look at doing this is provide the English-only list to your translation provider, have them translate the terminology into each language, and then submit that back to your in-country folks for review and approval. Once you've done that, you've gotten their buy-in on the terms that are going to be used throughout the translation process. Again, this takes a little effort to do at the front end of the project. It may slow you down from actually beginning your project, but by doing this, you're going to ensure that everybody's happy with the translation that they receive. Basically, you're asking your in-country folks what it is they want, and then you're providing it for them. A lot of our clients will stop right there. They won't go any further in engaging their in-country native speakers in the translation process. However, if you think you need to take that to the next step, then you're going to want to exercise a lot of care in selecting the individual reviewers that you're going to be using. You're going to want to look carefully at what their qualifications are, what standards you're going to expect them to adhere to, what they're going to do, and the timeline that you're going to give them to do it, because time is always a big factor when it comes to translations. There's a lot of tactics that you can employ to manage the review process, and this is why we encourage you to let your vendor know up front that you're going to be utilizing reviewers. What you want to do is limit any input that's going to prolong your project or distract you from your core goal of getting the translation completed instead of adding value. We urge you to stick with a very small, consistent team of colleagues that you trust. You want them to be able to follow instructions, and you want them to respond to you promptly. Keep in mind that with languages, there's not necessarily any right or wrong answers. So by staying with a consistent small team, you can avoid situations where you're changing wording this time to suit one reviewer's preferences and then changing it back on the next project to please a different reviewer. Obviously, the reviewers have to be able to understand what it is you're trying to communicate, and they should understand how your company speaks about your products and your services and all the jargon that you use to do so. Should be someone with excellent written communication skills, and they do need to understand your source language. So it's not enough that they happen to be your Latin American sales rep. They may speak wonderful Spanish, but if they can't fully command English, then you're going to have difficulty in utilizing them as a translation reviewer. You also need to carefully define what it is you expect these folks to do, what your goals are for the project, and make sure that everyone's on the same page. We run into a lot of hiccups when the in-country reviewer either isn't reviewing the right things or they're not aligned with your goals. So for example, if you're putting together a marketing piece, branding, messaging, your corporate voice are very important. If you're putting together an engineering technical piece, precision and accuracy may be more important to you. So you want to make sure that the folks are on board with what you're trying to accomplish. Very often reviewers are not certain of the type and depth of feedback that they should be providing, and this can add a lot of time to the process and cause frustration on both sides. How you ask the reviewer to review the translation can make or break this process. Don't just ask somebody what they think of a translation. You're going to get a wide range of responses, and you're going to have certain reviewers who feel that it's their responsibility to redline your entire document. So if you're very specific, for example, ask somebody if the product descriptions in the translation match what they use in the field, or if your industry terms are being utilized correctly. The more specific you are, the more likely you are to limit the amount of feedback that you receive and also to receive more relevant feedback. Just like if you took your English file and routed around your office, Some reviewers feel obligated to make changes just because you asked, and others are going to simply glance at the file and tell you that it looks okay. You don't want your project delayed, particularly multilingual projects. If there's one reviewer out there that takes a long time to respond, you don't want to have the whole project hung up waiting for that one reviewer. And you also want to avoid spending a lot of time arguing with somebody about whether or not their personal preferences are important changes to make to documentation. You know, you say potato, they say potato. It really isn't worth spending a lot of time debating that. So again, provide clear direction on exactly what it is that they should be doing, how much time you're giving them to provide that input, and exactly what you're looking for. You may even want to go a step further and make them work to provide you with changes. And by that I mean make them justify any changes that they want to make. Explain to me why your phrase or your wording is better than what the translator provided. And you may even want to go so far as to give them a spreadsheet, one column for them to insert the phrase or the words that they want changed, and another column for them to provide their recommended change, and a third column for them to provide their justification. Anything that you can do to make them really think about how important their changes are to your project. You want to keep the deadline short and require that the feedback be very specific. And again, your goal is to get only minimal input, but to be sure that your critical details are in fact checked. Let's give you an example. Let's say you're a mattress manufacturer. So you've got that tag that says, do not remove this tag under any circumstances. It's critical to ensure that the words do not are included in the translation. If they get omitted, then the message changes completely. What's not important is to spend a lot of time debating whether this is a tag or whether it should be called a label. That really doesn't make much difference in the meaning of your communication. So you're going to want to limit that type of discussion as much as possible. Most of the quote corrections that we receive to translations are actually user preferences. That is, they have no direct impact on the meaning of the communication. Remember, if you're engaging a professional translation services firm with an established quality process, not only has a translation already been completed by a qualified professional translator, in all likelihood, it's already been checked by a second professional translator. So the odds that it will be wrong are very small. So get only feedback that contributes to your goals without creating a lot of unnecessary activity that can totally derail your project schedule. Okay, so what can possibly go wrong? I've used this example here. Let's say that you're commissioned with getting a portrait for your corporate lobby. And you sit through a lot of meetings with top executives discussing exactly what it is that they would like to see. And now you're going to go out and you're going to commission someone to create a portrait for your lobby. You go out on Etsy and you find somebody who delivers this masterpiece. Then you start asking others what they think. However, those people that you reach out to don't have any idea of what your goals are or the direction that you've been given. They haven't sat in on any of the meetings. So what do you think the first comments you're going to receive are? They're going to complain that Mona Lisa's not smiling. Of course, that's not what you were going for. It can get even worse. As word gets out to others that you've commissioned this portrait for your lobby, people are going to have input based on all kinds of things. And a lot of that input's going to be really ludicrous. And I've purposely selected this example because we have experienced equally ridiculous situations when it comes to in-country reviews. And that's the reason I urge you to carefully manage this process and the input that you're going to receive. Otherwise, the masterpiece that you've created, whether it's your product manual, your brochure, your catalog, it may end up being a Pirates of the Caribbean Lisa. Okay, next tip. Get started early. Not only do we always encourage you to leave a lot of time to complete your translation projects, but if you're going to involve reviewers, involve them as early in the process as possible. And of course, let your vendor know that they're going to be involved. The last thing that we want as your vendor to hear after we've delivered a project is to have you come back to us a few weeks later and tell us that your reviewers told you it's all wrong. For one thing, that's rarely accurate feedback, but the input tends to be very emotionally charged. You'll hear things like, this translation's completely unusable, it's terrible, who did you use to do this? They couldn't possibly have been a native speaker. All kinds of false accusations about the quality and the process that was used to provide your translation. Hearing this sort of feedback is very upsetting to you. We don't like to hear it, obviously. If we've provided you with a translation, we don't want to hear that we did a terrible job. And our translators, who put a lot of energy into the whole process, really do know what they're doing. They don't want to hear this either. This is very distressing for them. So it's best to let us know up front if you're planning to incorporate feedback from your field so that we can help you manage the process, avoid some of the common pitfalls and all the associated headaches. It's not advisable to wait until a project's complete before you solicit feedback from the field. This would be the equivalent of letting your building contractor install the tile in your bathroom before you ask your spouse how they like it. It's much easier to make a change at the very beginning than to have everything fully installed and then have to rip it out. Just like you wouldn't print your English file before asking for feedback from the field, you want to make sure that you incorporate the reviewer preferences, whether it's in the form of a glossary or other input, as early in the process as possible. We advise our clients, if they're going to be using in-field reviewers, to let them look at unformatted text. Give them a plain Word file versus a fully formatted website, InDesign, or FrameMaker file. When they're looking at text only, they're much less likely to be distracted by graphics, and they're also much less likely to edit the entire piece. The added benefit for you is it's a lot easier to incorporate this feedback prior to formatting. It's a lot quicker, and you won't risk having to pay to have your files reformatted. We also advise our clients to begin with their English file, since very often the translation issues that get reported are really comments about your original text. For example, there might be policies that don't apply in a specific region, or there might be a specific set of products that's emphasized more or less in a foreign market. So when your sales manager or your distributor complains about the translation, they might really be making a comment about the content of your original source file. I'll give you an example that we encountered with one of our medical device manufacturer clients. We were translating clinical documentation for them into a variety of languages. Those documents were then used by physicians in the field to do the initial clinical trials, things like patient consent forms and related documentation. Well, we started getting a lot of complaints about mistakes in our Dutch translations. And it got to the point where we actually got called into this client for a meeting with some of the head folks in their quality control group. Why are we having all these mistakes with Dutch translations? The other languages are fine. These Dutch translations are terrible. Look at all the changes that we're getting back from the physicians in the field. Well, the project manager at ILS did her homework. She had the changes reviewed by Dutch translators. And what we found was these weren't corrections to the translations. These were changes to the text that the physicians were requesting in the field. They were basically just changing up the text so that it had a more natural flow to them in terms of how they wanted to interact with their patients in the field. Once we explained that to our client and they understood what was happening, they made the decision that it was okay to accept what was actually user preferences in the field. They could have saved a lot of time by getting approval on the English documentation first. Then they could have made a decision to change the English and had that changed English translated rather than having the original English translated into Dutch, having their physicians in the field review the Dutch, make these changes, send them back, have them all reviewed, update the files. I'm going to give you another illustration of how this works. This is a typical scenario that's played out every single day. A woman who has had long hair for maybe her entire life goes to the hair salon, decides she wants something different, has it all cut off. She comes home, first thing she says to her partner, husband, or significant other, "Honey, what do you think of my haircut?" 9 times out of 10, honey is completely speechless. I can guarantee you that reaction has nothing to do with the quality of the haircut or the skills of the hairstylist. It usually has everything to do with whether the person you're asking was accustomed to seeing this individual with long hair or happens to love long hair. Has nothing to do with whether the hairstyle is flattering. Professional translation editors have one major role, and that's to ensure that your translation correctly conveys the same message as your source file. They do not inject their personal opinions or preferences about what you should or should not do or what they think is better. So if you tell your professional services vendor that you want short hair is what you're going to get. However, when you are dealing with languages, your native speakers may go to a lot of time and trouble to try and convince you that long hair is the only way to go. It's probably not true. Your reviewers have a tendency to edit text. So if you're going to allow them to do this, it's best to do it before the translation process even begins by having them work with your English file. Your goal is to have one English version that's consistent across all of your target languages. So if you're translating into 12 languages, you're going to want one message across 12 languages. You don't want one English message and then 12 variations all edited according to the personal preferences of whoever is reviewing the translations. And if you've taken our advice and started with a glossary, you've already provided information to the translation services team, so the translation that comes out of that process should be spot on. At that point, the only feedback that you should be receiving is, yes, this is fantastic, thank you so much. Any feedback that you receive from the field should be assessed for its validity, and also so that you can determine whether it's actual correction or whether it's a reflection of the reviewer's preferences. These are your files. If you decide to accept the reviewer edits, such as our medical device client did with their Dutch translations, that's fine. You do whatever you think is best, but be sure that you do it based on factual information. Enlist the assistance of your translation provider to review the comments and see what they actually indicate before you decide what to do. If you've gone and hired a professional translation services provider and you're comfortable with their qualifications and you're still not sure that you want to accept the translations that they've provided for you, well, then you certainly shouldn't be blindly accepting the input from your reviewers in the field. Find out what's really going on. And if you're not 100% confident, ask your translation services provider to tell you, are these changes preferential? Do they change the meaning? And do they legitimately improve the communication? That third bullet is really the rule of thumb for translation editors. When we have your documents translated and we go to the second step of our quality process and we have reviewers edit the translations, usually they're only making a change if they can legitimately improve the communication. If you do decide to go ahead and accept the input from your field reviewers, you should have your vendor update your files. This isn't something that you want to do on your own at the end of the project on the fly. You want the updates that you've accepted to be stored in your translation memory so that there's a record for your future projects. So again, make the decision whether or not to accept the reviewer feedback based on objective data that you're getting from your translation services vendor. Reviewers very often have motivations that have nothing to do with your goals. For example, if you're using a distributor, maybe sometimes that distributor has gotten paid to provide translations for you. Maybe they get paid by other clients, and now you've taken upon yourself to provide your own translations, and they're out of the loop, and they may be angry about that. We encounter reviewers who have a not invented here syndrome, where they don't believe that any translations that they haven't provided themselves or that haven't been provided by their local preferred vendor can't possibly be correct. We hear this all the time. How can a US company possibly provide French translations for Canada that are right? There's a host of other reasons why reviewers might not like your translations, and it's incumbent upon you to evaluate what's actually happening. Usually, there's some very strong personalities involved that can take up a lot of your time. You have to convince them that the quality process has been followed and that the translations are in fact correct. That's again why it's important to select your reviewers carefully, get everybody on the same page with some common ground rules, and to make informed decisions about the feedback that you receive. Lastly, you need to decide who within your organization is going to get the final say. If you've got multiple reviewers in each country, and the engineer tells you one thing, the vice president of sales tells you something else, the marketing person has a different opinion, how are you going to resolve those conflicts? In some parts of the world, everybody is convinced that they're a language expert. This is very helpful to have a game plan laid out in advance. When all is said and done, you're going to want to have confidence in the translations that you're utilizing. Again, there's usually no clear right or wrong when it comes to language, but you get a lot of conflicting information. If you've given care into thoughtfully selecting your vendor and equal care into choosing your in-country reviewers, it's going to make your project go a lot smoother, and it's going to help you complete your project on time. Okay, I'm going to open up our discussion now to questions and answers. Again, there's a chat pane. If you just click on your mouse and scroll to the bottom of the screen, if you want to type in any questions there, we'll try and get to as many as we can in the remaining few minutes that we have here. Okay, the first question deals with the timeline. How much time should I allow for the in-country review? Well, this depends on the length of your file, but rule of thumb is to allow as little time as possible. The reason is you want to get back to your translation provider with feedback while they're still engaged. When we deliver a project to a client, they come back to us within a few days with questions or feedback. That's a customer service issue for us. We want to make sure that they understand what they're hearing and that it gets resolved to their satisfaction as quickly as possible. If they come back to us 3 months from now, the translators have already moved on. You're probably already using that document. Maybe you've already printed it and it's already been distributed in your field. That's not really a great time to try and come back. You may also incur costs at that point for formatting if the whole document needs to be redone. The sooner you come back to your translation services provider with feedback, the easier and more cost-effective it's going to be. Okay, here's a question that relates to whether or not a professional agency will review translations that are provided within your organization. So basically, this is the inverse of what we've been talking about, taking your in-house translations and floating them by a professional services agency for review. The shorter answer is yes, of course, we'll be happy to do this for you. We'll require your English source document as well as your translation, and we'll sit down, we will review them side by side to make sure that the translation is an accurate reflection of your original English message. But there's a lot of caveats related to this type of a review, since we don't know the source of the translations that you've provided us. So if they've been provided by non-professionals, non-native speakers, if they're machine translations, or they're just done by somebody who didn't understand the subject matter, or perhaps didn't understand the source language, very often these translations are such a mess that we're going to recommend retranslation rather than trying to fix them. It's easy to correct a word here and there, some grammar, punctuation, insert something that's been omitted. It's not so easy to make a correction if the sentence structure needs to be completely redone. Are there any other questions? If not, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody again for taking the time to join us today. We'll be sending out a copy of this presentation so that you've got my contact information and you can feel free to share it with anyone in your organization that you would like. It will also be posted on our website within the next few days. So thanks so much for your time, and go ahead and have a great rest of the day.